Hello again, folks. Two very big developments have taken place in recent weeks during the Ukraine war. First, Putin mobilised about 300,000 Russian troops to form the next wave of his fighting force. And just last Friday, he grabbed more land, declaring 15% of eastern Ukraine was now effectively part of the Russian Federation after a referendum. No one outside Russia has taken that seriously, but what it shows is that Putin does not care.
Nobody can destroy this love. They're becoming our citizens forever.
Just does what he wants. The war is now almost 8 months old, but in actuality it's 8 years old. And once again, Putin threatened the use of nuclear weapons, which drew this fearsome rebuke from Joe Biden.
America and its allies are not going, let me emphasize, are not going to be intimidated, are not going to be intimidated by Putin and his reckless words and threats. He's not going to scare us, and he doesn't or intimidate us.
Now, if we turn that around, I think it's safe to assume that Putin is not intimidated by Biden. Not from an American leader who just last week had another brain fade when he searched for someone in a room, forgetting the woman he was looking for, Jackie Walorski, died in a car crash a month prior.
Representative Jackie, are you here? Where's Jackie?
Putin is a bloodthirsty maniac, and many critics have claimed that his most recent declarations are the work of a desperate man out of moves. But despite the brave efforts of Ukrainian fighters, Russia is not losing this war. Russia is too big and has too much at its disposal. Putin is just exercising options that are available to him. Ukrainian forces have been backed by the very generous amounts of military equipment and aid from countries right around the world. The US has spent billions of dollars it doesn't have to back Zelensky's army. European nations have done the same. Little old Australia is more than pulling its weight at a time when we are all dealing with a cost of living crisis. And yet Russian forces are still there, still bedding in for the winter. Western nations tried to cripple Russia's $1.8 trillion economy with a huge arsenal of sanctions. Businesses and individuals had assets frozen. Diplomats were expelled. Travel bans were introduced. Yet, Russian forces are still there in Ukraine, still bedding in for the long haul. Sanctions have not worked. At least they didn't have the desired effect. And one of the great absurdities of this war is that the West is still funding it. The BBC reported just last week that Russia received about $500 billion over the past year from oil and gas exports to Europe. In fact, high prices pushed up the amount Russia earns from crude oil exports by 41%. And that will continue because once the EU eventually cuts the oil it now buys, it'll take months to fully come into effect, and even then, Russia will just sell it elsewhere. China is already buying more and less expensive energy supplies from Russia this year. And it's a policy that's backfired against Europe as gas prices soar in the lead up to winter, exposing its own failures, highlighting an over-reliance on Russian gas. But the European Union's still pushing ahead with its game of sanctions, which amount to another slap on the wrist.
So we propose sweeping new import bans on Russian products. This will keep Russian products out of the European market and deprive Russia of an additional 7 billion euros in revenues.
Putin, of course, expects all of this. And the only man who can really stop the war is Xi Jinping. But China is increasing its energy purchases, as I just said, at a cheaper rate. He's not going to jeopardise that deal just yet. Then there's Putin's nuclear threat. If Ukraine is fast-tracked in its push to join NATO and therefore benefits from the Euro pledge that an attack on one is an attack on all, does that mean Putin then really becomes desperate and squeezes the nuclear trigger? Then comes World War III. That thought is frightening. And finally, more and more Americans have had enough, it seems. According to a new poll conducted by the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, 57% of likely voters strongly or somewhat support the US pursuing diplomatic negotiations as soon as possible to end the war in Ukraine, even if it requires Ukraine making compromises. Just 32% of respondents were strongly or somewhat opposed to this. Almost half the respondents said they only support the continuation of US military aid to Ukraine if the US is involved in ongoing diplomacy to end the war. It doesn't feel like we're anywhere near that point. Thanks for watching. Support this channel. Please like, share and subscribe below. I'll see you next week.